Hey, stop scrolling for a second. This wasn't supposed to happen. A woman in a maid's uniform, gasping for air. A stranger's arm locked around her throat. And across the room, a man in a red velvet blazer, the richest man in the city, pointing a gun at a face he never expected to see in his own bedroom. Nobody in that penthouse knew how the night would end. Not the maid. Not the billionaire. Not even the man holding the knife to her ribs. Because in the next 60 seconds, everything about who these people really were, who they loved, who they trusted, who they were willing to die for, was about to come apart. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Alright, welcome back everybody. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from tonight and which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional ones we've told on this channel. A story about class, about loyalty, about a woman who cleaned floors for a living and a man who owned skyscrapers, and how one impossible night proved that the people closest to us aren't always the ones who love us most. I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to feel something. So get comfortable, grab something warm to drink, and let's begin. First, everything seemed normal. Danielle Carter woke up the way she always did. At 4:45 in the morning, before the sun, before the birds, before the city of Chicago even remembered it was awake. Her small apartment on the south side smelled like yesterday's coffee and the lavender detergent she used on her son's school uniforms. She moved through the dark kitchen without turning on the lights, because she knew every inch of that apartment by heart. The creak of the third floorboard, the way the refrigerator hummed a little louder in the winter, the exact spot on the counter where she left her keys so she wouldn't forget them in her rush. She was 34 years old, and if you had told her 10 years ago that her life would look like this, a single mother, a 6-year-old son named Micah asleep in the next room, a job cleaning the penthouse of one of the richest men in America, she probably would have laughed. Back then she had dreams of nursing school, of a husband who stayed, of a life that didn't require her to leave her son with her elderly neighbor 5 days a week before the sun came up. But life doesn't ask you what you planned. Just happens and you learn to hold on. Danny kissed Micah's forehead before she left, careful not to wake him, and whispered the same thing she whispered every morning. Mama's gonna make today count. You make yours count too. Then she caught the 5:20 train downtown, transferred once, and walked the last 6 blocks in the cold because the bus was always late and she could never afford to be. By 7 a.m., she was standing in the private elevator of the Whitfield Tower, badge in hand, heading up to the top floor, the penthouse of Nathaniel Whitfield. If you didn't know his name, you'd know his buildings. Whitfield Group owned half the skyline of Chicago. Hotels, residential towers, a tech investment arm that had made him a billionaire by the age of 31. He was 34 now, the same age as Danny, though their lives could not have looked more different. He had inherited the beginnings of his empire from a father who died when he was 22, and he had spent the last 12 years turning that inheritance into something enormous, and turning himself along the way into someone very alone. Danny had worked in his home for 3 years. She had seen the version of Nathaniel Whitfield that the business magazines never printed, the man who forgot to eat when he was buried in work, who kept his late mother's reading glasses in his nightstand drawer even though she'd been gone since he was 17, who once sat in his enormous empty kitchen at 2 a.m. eating cereal straight from the box because he didn't know how to ask anyone to stay and talk to him. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said that day, the way he always did, looking up from his laptop at the kitchen island. He was the only person in that building who called her Ms. Carter, instead of just the maid, or worse, nothing at all. "Morning, Mr. Whitfield," she said, setting her bag down by the pantry. "You didn't sleep again." It wasn't a question. She could always tell. The same wrinkled shirt from yesterday, the same shadows under his eyes, the coffee cup that had clearly been refilled at least 4 times since midnight. He gave her a tired half-smile. "Big week. The Ellison deal closes Friday. After that, I promise, I'll sleep for a year." "You said that about the last deal too," she said, and he laughed. Actually laughed, a real one, the kind she rarely heard from him. There was an easiness between them that neither of them talked about out loud. He asked about Micah sometimes, remembered his name, remembered that he liked dinosaurs, once left a small toy triceratops on the counter with a sticky note that just said, "For the little man." She never told anyone at the house about it. It felt like something private, something that didn't belong in the world of penthouses and press releases. But that morning something was different. As Danny began wiping down the counters, she noticed Nathaniel's phone buzz against the marble, over and over, a name flashing each time. Vanessa. Vanessa Cole. Nathaniel's fiancée. Beautiful, sharp-edged, always dressed like she was walking into a photo shoot, even at breakfast. Danny had never liked her, though she'd never said so to a single soul. There was something about the way Vanessa looked at the staff, through them, past them like they were part of the furniture, that made Danny's skin crawl. And there was something about the way she looked at Nathaniel, too. Not quite love. More like appraisal. Nathaniel didn't pick up the call. He silenced it, jaw tightening, and went back to his laptop. "Everything all right?" Danny asked carefully. "Fine," he said too quickly. "Just wedding stuff. Vanessa wants to move the date up. Says she doesn't want to wait until spring anymore." Danny said nothing, but something in her chest tightened, a small, unexplainable unease, like a draft slipping in under a locked door. She didn't know why. She just knew that when Vanessa Cole wanted something moved up, it was rarely about romance. She had no idea, standing in that sunlit kitchen with a dish towel in her hand, that in less than 2 weeks, that unease would save her life, and that the real danger in that penthouse was never going to come from a stranger at all. But it ended in a way no one imagined. The days after that ticked by the way they always did in the Whitfield residence. Quiet, orderly, full of small routines that Danny had come to find comfort in. She dusted the same shelves, ironed the same crisp shirts, watered the same fig tree in the corner of the living room that Nathaniel forgot existed until it started drooping. And every morning, without fail, he was there before her, already awake, already working, already carrying some invisible weight that never seemed to leave his shoulders. She learned more about him in fragments, the way people do when they share a space but not a world. She learned his mother died of cancer when he was 17, and his father, already cold and distant, became colder afterward, pouring everything into the business and nothing into his son. She learned Nathaniel built half his empire trying to prove to a dead man that he mattered. She learned he hadn't taken a real vacation in 6 years. She learned that underneath the tailored suits and boardroom confidence, there was a boy who still flinched a little every time someone raised their voice. And she learned, slowly, uncomfortably, that Vanessa Cole raised her voice a lot. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Danny first heard it, really heard it, not just caught pieces through a closed door. She was in the hallway outside Nathaniel's study, arms full of folded linens, when Vanessa's voice cut through the wood like a blade. "I'm not asking you to feel something, Nathaniel. I'm asking you to sign the papers. The prenup review isn't complicated. My lawyer just wants it finalized before the wedding. That's normal. It's not normal to change the terms 3 times in 2 months, Van." Nathaniel's voice was tired, flat, the voice of a man too exhausted to fight anymore. "What is this really about?" "It's about protecting both of us," Vanessa said, too smooth, too rehearsed. "That's what people who love each other do." Danny stood frozen in the hallway, feeling like she'd stepped somewhere she shouldn't have. She moved on quickly, quietly, telling herself it wasn't her business. Rich people's marriages were rich people's marriages. She had bills to pay and a son to raise. She didn't have room in her life to worry about billionaires and their prenups. But something about Vanessa's voice stayed with her. Not the words, the tone. The way you talked to someone you were managing, not someone you were marrying. That same week, a man started showing up more often. Marcus Riley, Nathaniel's oldest friend and the co-founder of Whitfield Group's investment arm. Danny had met him a dozen times over the years. He was charming in the practiced way of men who'd spent their whole lives being liked. He always brought a joke for the staff, always tipped well during the holidays, always called Nathaniel brother, like they'd grown up on the same street instead of meeting at business school. But lately Marcus's visits had changed. He and Nathaniel would disappear into the study for hours, and Danny would hear raised voices. Not the easy laughter of old friends, but something tighter, more strained. Once she caught the tail end of a sentence as she passed with a vacuum. "The board's going to vote either way, Nate, whether you like it or not." She didn't understand the specifics. She wasn't meant to. But she understood tension, and she understood fear disguised as business talk, because she'd spent her whole life reading the moods of people who held power over her paycheck. One evening, after Marcus had left and Vanessa had gone home in her sleek black car, Nathaniel sat alone at the kitchen island long after Danny should have gone home herself. She was finishing the last of the dishes when she noticed him just staring. Nothing. His shoulders curled inward, like the weight he carried had finally gotten too heavy to hide. "You should eat something," she said gently, setting a plate of leftover pasta in front of him before she could stop herself. It wasn't her job to feed him. It had never been part of her duties. But something in her couldn't just walk past a man who looked that alone in a house that big. He looked up surprised, and for a moment something in his face softened completely, the sea mask slipping just for a second, revealing someone much younger, much more tired. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said quietly. "You're the only person in my life right now who doesn't want something from me." Danny didn't know what to say to that. So she just nodded and finished the dishes, and drove home that night thinking about how strange it was, that a man with everything could sound so much like someone with nothing at all. She had no way of knowing that within days, that very loneliness, and the people circling it, would put a gun in his hand and her life on the line. Then everything changed. The morning it happened started like any other. Danny arrived at 7 o'clock, badge in hand, the elevator humming her up to the top floor of a building that touched the clouds. But something was wrong the moment the doors opened. The penthouse was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of an early morning before Nathaniel woke. This was a heavier silence, the kind that presses against your ears. The kitchen light was off. His laptop, always open, always glowing at this hour, was closed and pushed to the side of the counter like it hadn't been touched. "Mr. Whitfield," she called out, setting her bag down slowly. No answer. She noticed the side door near the service hallway, the one that led to the private stairwell, rarely used, always locked, was cracked open. Just an inch. Just enough. Her heart began to hammer. She told herself it was nothing. Maintenance, maybe. Delivery. But every instinct in her body, the same instinct that had kept her and her son safe through years of hard neighborhoods and harder men, told her something was deeply wrong. She should have left. She should have turned around, walked back into that elevator and called security from the lobby. She thought about it. She really did, for one full second, her hand hovering near the elevator button. But then she heard it. A muffled sound from the direction of the study. Not quite a voice. More like someone struggling to breathe. Against every warning bell in her mind, Danny walked toward it. The study door was ajar. Through the gap, she saw a man she didn't recognize. Tall, dressed in black, a ski mask rolled up on his forehead like he hadn't expected to need it yet, going through the drawers of Nathaniel's desk with practiced, unhurried hands. Not panic. Not the movements of a random burglar who'd broken a window and grabbed the nearest jewelry. This man moved like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for, and exactly where to find it. On the floor beside the desk lay Nathaniel's personal safe, the small one bolted beneath the bookshelf that almost no one knew existed. It was already open. That detail hit Danny harder than anything else. Almost no one knew that safe existed. She barely knew, and she'd worked in this house for 3 years. Whoever this man was, he hadn't broken in blind. He'd been told exactly where to look. Danny's breath caught, and in that half-second of held silence, a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The man's head snapped up. For one terrible suspended moment, Their eyes met across the room. Hers wide with fear, his cold and calculating, the eyes of a man deciding in real time what she was worth to him. A witness to eliminate or a tool to use. He chose the second. Before Danny could turn to run, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and grabbed her, one arm locking around her throat, the other hand closing over her mouth to silence the scream that never had the chance to escape. She fought, clawed at his sleeve, twisted, kicked backward. But he was strong, trained in a way that told her this wasn't his first time doing something like this. "Don't!" he growled low in her ear, voice flat and controlled. "You scream, you die. Simple as that." Her mind raced to Micah, to his small face asleep this morning, to the promise she'd whispered to him. Make today count, and terror closed around her heart tighter than the man's arm around her throat. That was when she heard the elevator chime from the hallway. A step. A voice calling out, confused, concerned. "Ms. Carter. Whose car is that downstairs?" Nathaniel Whitfield walked into his own study and stopped cold, the blood draining from his face as he took in the scene in front of him. A masked intruder gripping his housekeeper by the throat, a rifled-through safe, and a silence so sharp it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. "Let her go," Nathaniel said, his voice shaking with a fury Danny had never heard from him before. The kidnapper's grip only tightened. "Not a chance," he said. "Not until I get what I came for." And that was the moment Danny realized, with a cold and sinking certainty, that this had never been a robbery at all. Nobody was prepared for what came next. Nathaniel's hands were shaking, but his voice stayed level. The voice of a man who had learned, over years of boardroom warfare, how to sound calm even when everything inside him was screaming. "Whatever they're paying you," he said slowly, taking one careful step forward. "I'll double it. Let her go and we walk away from this. No police. No questions." The masked man laughed, short, humorless. "You think this is about money, Whitfield?" He tightened his grip on Danny's throat, and she gasped, her fingers clawing uselessly at his forearm. "This is about a contract. Somebody wants you gone. Tonight. And she," he jerked his head toward Danny. "She's just bad timing. Somebody wants you gone." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass, shattering something in Nathaniel's chest. His mind raced through every enemy he'd ever made, every board member he'd outmaneuvered, every deal that had left someone bitter. But none of it explained the safe. None of it explained how this man had known exactly where to find it, exactly when the penthouse would be empty of security, exactly which morning Danny would arrive early enough to walk into the middle of it. Only a handful of people knew this apartment's rhythms that well. Nathaniel's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, to his phone on the counter, still lit up from an earlier notification. Vanessa Cole, 3 missed calls. And beside it, a text from Marcus, sent at 6:47 that morning, just minutes before Danny had walked in. "Running late. Something came up. Talk later, brother. Something came up." The pieces did not fully connect yet. Not in that terrified, adrenaline-soaked moment, but a seed of horrible understanding had been planted, and it would not stop growing. "Please," Danny choked out, her voice raw and small. "I have a son. Please, I have a little boy." "Shut up," the kidnapper snapped, dragging her back a step as Nathaniel moved closer. "Don't touch her again," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice had changed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by something harder, more dangerous, the voice of a man realizing there was exactly one thing left in the world he was not willing to lose. "You want me. Fine. Let her walk out that door, and you can do whatever you came here to do." "Nathaniel, don't," Danny gasped, tears streaking down her face, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the man holding her, memorizing every inch of him, calculating. The kidnapper considered this for a long, terrible moment, his eyes narrowing behind the rolled-up mask. Then, slowly, he began backing toward the private stairwell door, dragging Danny with him, using her as a shield between himself and any exit route Nathaniel might have. "Here's what's gonna happen," the man said. "You're gonna stay right there. And she's coming with me until I'm 3 blocks from this building. Then I let her go, and you never see me again. You call the cops before then, she doesn't make it to the sidewalk." "No," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in the entire encounter, his voice cracked. "No, take the money, take anything in this apartment, but you are not walking out that door with her." He moved toward the small safe embedded behind a false panel in his closet, the one with something in it far more dangerous than cash. His hands trembled as he entered the combination, 3 numbers his father had taught him the year before he died, the same numbers Nathaniel had never changed even after 12 years, even after everything. The safe clicked open. Inside sat a handgun he had never once used outside of a firing range, licensed, registered, purchased after a break-in scare years earlier that he'd almost forgotten about, until this exact moment, when it was the only thing standing between Danny Carter and whatever this man intended to do to her 3 blocks from safety. His fingers closed around the grip. Behind him, through the study window, the first hint of morning light spilled gold across the Chicago skyline, indifferent to the terror unfolding 30 floors above the street. Somewhere down there, people were getting on trains, buying coffee, living lives that had no idea a woman's life was hanging in the balance in a penthouse they'd never stepped foot in. Nathaniel turned back toward the stairwell, gun raised, hands steadier than he expected them to be, and found himself staring down the barrel of his own resolve at a man dragging Danny Carter toward the door. "This wasn't supposed to happen," the kidnapper muttered, almost to himself, glancing at his watch like he was behind some invisible schedule. "You weren't even supposed to be home yet." And in that single sentence, "You weren't even supposed to be home yet," Nathaniel understood with sickening clarity that someone had planned this morning down to the minute. Someone who knew his schedule. Someone close enough to know exactly when he'd normally still be at the gym, exactly when the penthouse would be empty except for its housekeeper. Someone who was supposed to be the person he trusted most. Everyone thought they knew the answer. Time moves strangely when a gun is raised and a life hangs in the balance. To Nathaniel, standing there in his study with his arm outstretched and his heart slamming against his ribs, it felt like hours had passed since the kidnapper first grabbed Danny. In reality, less than 90 seconds had gone by. "Put the gun down," the man said, tightening his forearm against Danny's throat until she made a small, strangled sound that tore through Nathaniel like a blade. "Put it down or I break her neck right here, right now. If you hurt her, you'll never leave this building alive," Nathaniel said, and he meant it with a certainty that surprised even himself. 12 years of quiet, controlled, calculated business decisions. And here he was, discovering in real time that there was exactly one thing in his life he would kill for without hesitation. Danny's eyes found his over the man's forearm, wide, terrified, but somehow still trying to communicate something. Not "save me." Something more specific. Her gaze flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward the small decorative table beside the stairwell door, where a heavy crystal award, some business accolade Nathaniel had won years ago and never bothered to display anywhere more prominent, sat within her reach. He understood instantly. She was telling him she had an idea. She wanted him to keep the man talking. "You said someone hired you," Nathaniel said, forcing his voice into something calm, something reasonable, buying time. "Contracts like that usually come with a name attached. Who wants me gone badly enough to risk this?" The kidnapper's jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter. Not my business who or why. I do the job, I get paid, I disappear." "It matters to me," Nathaniel said. Humor a dying man's curiosity. Something flickered behind the man's eyes. Not quite guilt, but something close to hesitation. "Someone who knew this place a lot better than a random job usually allows," he said finally, almost against his will, like the pressure of the standoff was cracking something loose in him. "Gave me the safe combination. The security schedule. Even told me which mornings the maid comes in late so I'd have a clean window." Danny's breath caught. She almost never came in late. Except for the 2 days a week Micah had a doctor's appointment and she had to drop him with her neighbor first. Someone who knew her schedule that intimately wasn't guessing. They had access to the household calendar. Which meant this wasn't just someone who knew Nathaniel. It was someone who had access to both of their lives. Vanessa, Nathaniel breathed, the name slipping out before he could stop it, and something in the kidnapper's posture, a flicker, a held breath, an almost confirmation, told him he wasn't wrong. I didn't say a name, the man said quickly, too quickly. You didn't have to, Nathaniel said, and something inside him cracked wide open. Not fear anymore, but a grief so sudden and total it nearly buckled his knees. 2 years. 2 years of a relationship he had told himself was real, of a woman he had planned a wedding around, of a life he thought he understood. And all along, she's not even getting everything, the kidnapper added, almost bitterly, like a man tired of being the only one taking risks. Some guy business partner sounded like. He's the one running the money. She's just along for the ride. Prenup dissolves completely if you die before the wedding. Full inheritance, no conditions. Marcus. The name hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Marcus Riley. The boy he'd shared a dorm room with at 19. The man who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral. The partner he had trusted with half his company and all of his secrets. Something came up, the text had said. Something came up, while his best friend orchestrated the theft of everything Nathaniel had ever built, and possibly his life along with it. Danny watched the devastation move across Nathaniel's face and felt her own heart break for him even as her pulse hammered with terror. In the middle of her own fight to survive, she found herself aching for a man who was losing everything he thought he had in the same 60 seconds she was fighting to keep her own life. They used you, Nathaniel said quietly to the man holding the woman. He was only now realizing he could not imagine his life without. The same way they're using everyone in this room. You really willing to die today for people who won't even remember your name by next week? The kidnapper's grip on Danny faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. And Danny, trembling, terrified, and out of options, reached for the crystal award on the table beside her. Nobody could explain what happened next. Everything happened in less than 3 seconds, but to Danny, it stretched into something endless. The kind of moment your body remembers long after your mind has stopped replaying it. Her fingers closed around the heavy crystal award. With every ounce of strength she had left, strength built from years of carrying groceries up 4 flights of stairs, from lifting a sleeping 6-year-old out of car seats, from a life that had never once handed her anything easy, she swung it backward into the kidnapper's ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening in surprise and pain, and Danny wrenched herself sideways, breaking free just enough to stumble away from him, gasping, her hands flying to her bruised throat. "Get down!" Nathaniel shouted, and Danny dropped instinctively. Years of watching the news, years of instinct kicking in before thought even had the chance to catch up. The kidnapper recovered fast, faster than either of them expected, and lunged not toward Nathaniel, but toward Danny again, some cold professional part of him recognizing that she was still his only real leverage in the room. His hand closed around her wrist, yanking her back toward him, and in the chaos, something metallic clattered from his jacket to the floor. A knife, small and folding, skittering across the hardwood. "Don't," Nathaniel said again, gun raised, finger hovering near the trigger. His hands steadier now than they had been the entire encounter, because somewhere in the last 30 seconds, fear had burned away and left only clarity behind. "This is your last chance to walk away." "You won't shoot," the kidnapper said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Guy like you doesn't have it in him." "You don't know what I have in me," Nathaniel said quietly. "You don't know what she means to this house." Danny, still held at arm's length, still trapped, felt something in her chest crack open at those words. Not fear this time, but something warmer, something that had no business existing in the middle of a life-or-death standoff. And yet there it was, unmistakable. She means to this house. 3 years of small kindnesses, of shared quiet mornings, Of a man who remembered her son's name and left toy dinosaurs on the counter. None of it had been invisible after all. He had seen her. All along he had seen her. The kidnapper's eyes darted between Nathaniel and the stairwell door, calculating his odds, and in that flicker of hesitation, Danny did the only thing she could think to do. She went limp, not fainting, but deliberately dropping her full weight downward, using gravity against the arm that held her, forcing the man to either drop her or bend awkwardly to keep his grip. He bent. And in that half-second where his balance shifted and his focus split between holding her weight and watching Nathaniel, the angle finally opened. "Nathaniel!" Danny screamed, twisting free at last, throwing herself sideways out of the line of fire. Everything after that happened almost too fast to process. A blur of motion, of sound, of a sharp, deafening crack that seemed to swallow the entire room. Nathaniel pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the kidnapper in the shoulder, spinning him backward with a cry of pain. His own momentum sending him crashing into the small table by the stairwell door. He crumpled, clutching his shoulder, blood already spreading dark across his black jacket, and for one suspended silent moment, nobody in that study moved at all. Then Danny was scrambling backward across the floor, gasping, sobbing, alive, and Nathaniel was crossing the room in 3 strides, gun still raised at the man on the floor but eyes only on her, dropping to his knees beside her, hands hovering over her like he was afraid to touch her and afraid not to. "Are you hurt? Danny, are you hurt?" It was the first time in 3 years he had ever used her first name. "I'm okay," she gasped, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them still. "I'm okay. I'm okay." Behind them, the wounded kidnapper groaned, immobilized, no longer any threat at all. And somewhere far below, sirens were already beginning to wail, called in by a neighbor who'd heard the gunshot echo down 30 floors of steel and glass. But the danger inside that penthouse was over. The danger circling Nathaniel Whitfield's life, the one wearing a designer engagement ring, the one who called him brother, was only just beginning to be understood. The truth was hiding in plain sight. The next hour dissolved into flashing lights and clipped radio chatter as Chicago PD swarmed the penthouse, followed by paramedics who stabilized the wounded kidnapper, now identified through his record as a man named Corey Dax, a hired security contractor with a history of freelance jobs that skirted the edges of legality. He was cuffed to a hospital bed within the hour, and it did not take long, under the weight of an attempted murder charge, for him to start talking. Detective Renate Ochoa, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had clearly seen every version of wealthy Chicago's ugliest secrets, sat across from Nathaniel and Danny in the penthouse's living room as her partner took photographs of the rifled safe. "Mr. Dax is cooperating," she said, flipping through her notes. "Says he was hired 3 weeks ago through an intermediary. Never met his employer directly, just wired money and instructions. But he did overhear a phone call, 2 days before the job, mentioning a name. Riley." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Beside him, Danny sat wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given her, a paramedic's gentle bruising cream already applied to the marks on her throat, her hands still trembling faintly around a cup of untouched tea. "Marcus," Nathaniel said quietly. "It wasn't a question anymore. We're bringing him in for questioning within the hour," Ochoa confirmed. "And Ms. Cole." Vanessa's name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Danny watched Nathaniel's face carefully, bracing herself for grief, for denial, for the kind of shock that made people defend the people they loved even against overwhelming evidence. But instead, something in his expression settled, not into anger, but into a strange, exhausted clarity, like a man finally allowed to stop pretending he hadn't noticed something wrong for a very long time. "There were signs," he admitted quietly, once the detective had stepped away to take a call. "The prenup changes. The way she kept pushing the wedding date up. I told myself it was nerves. I wanted it to be nerves." He looked down at his hands, still faintly trembling from adrenaline that had not fully left his system. I think some part of me always knew Vanessa loved the idea of this. He gestured vaguely at the penthouse, the skyline, the life around them, more than she loved me. I just didn't want to admit it, because admitting it meant admitting I was alone again. Danny didn't know what to say to that, so she said the truest thing she could offer. You're not alone. Not today. Something passed between them then. Quiet, unspoken, heavier than either of them was ready to name out loud. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, taking in the bruises on her throat, the exhaustion in her eyes, the sheer improbable fact that she was still sitting in front of him at all. You could have run, he said softly. The second that door was open. You could have gone straight back to that elevator. I heard someone in trouble, Danny said simply. I couldn't just leave. You have a son, he said, almost gently accusing, like he needed her to understand the weight of what she'd risked. You could have died in there, Danny. Over a job that pays you $30 an hour. Her chin lifted slightly, some old, tired dignity rising up through the exhaustion. My son is the reason I couldn't leave, she said. What kind of mother could I be to him if I taught him that walking past someone in danger was the smart thing to do? Nathaniel stared at her, and something in his chest, something that had been closed off and armored for as long as he could remember, cracked open just a little further. Across the city, in a downtown office building, Marcus Riley was answering his phone to find two detectives waiting in his lobby. And in a boutique 2 blocks from Michigan Avenue, Vanessa Cole was trying on wedding dresses, utterly unaware that the life she had spent months engineering was about to collapse around her before the sun went down. Don't blink. You'll miss the biggest twist. Marcus Riley did not go quietly. By the time detectives arrived at the Whitfield Group's downtown offices, he had already heard, through a frantic call from an assistant, that Corey Dax had been shot and arrested. He sat behind his glass desk on the 42nd floor, hands folded, doing his best impression of a man completely blindsided. This is insane, he told the detectives. His voice pitched perfectly between outrage and disbelief. The tone of a man who'd spent a career negotiating boardrooms and knew exactly how to sound innocent. Nathaniel is my best friend. I've known him since we were 19 years old. Whoever gave you my name is lying. But Detective Ochoa had done this long enough to know that guilty men rehearsed their outrage a little too carefully. And rehearsed outrage cracks fast under real pressure. It cracked when they showed him the wire transfer records. 3 payments totaling $80,000, routed through a shell account that traced, after 2 hours of digging, back to a company Marcus had quietly set up 18 months earlier. It cracked further when they revealed that Corey Dax, now facing a decade in prison, had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, and had already named Marcus in a recorded statement. But what finally broke him completely was learning that Vanessa Cole, sitting in a separate interrogation room 3 doors down, had begun talking the moment she realized Marcus wasn't going to protect her. It was his idea, she said, mascara streaking down her face, all pretense of composure abandoned. The company was in trouble. Marcus made bad bets on some crypto fund, lost almost everything, and the board was going to force him out within the year if he couldn't cover the losses. He came to me 8 months ago. Said if something happened to Nathaniel before the wedding, the prenup would be void completely. Full inheritance, no restrictions. He said we'd split it. Said it was the only way either of us would survive what was coming. And you agreed, Ochoa said flatly. Vanessa's hands shook around the tissue she'd been given. I told myself it was just a plan, that it would never actually happen. And then Marcus said Corey could make it look like a random break-in gone wrong, and it felt so far removed from anything real She stopped, pressing the tissue to her eyes. I never thought about the maid. I never even considered she'd be there. I didn't think about anyone getting hurt at all. It was a small, cowardly kind of confession, the kind that admitted guilt while still trying to minimize it, still trying to make herself the least culpable person in a plot to end a man's life for money. But it was enough. Combined with Marcus's financial records, Corey's testimony, and the phone records placing calls between all three conspirators in the days leading up to the attack, it was more than enough. By nightfall, both Marcus Riley and Vanessa Cole were formally charged. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, fraud. The story broke across every local news station by 9 p.m., then picked up nationally by morning. Billionaire's fiancé and business partner charged in plot to kill him for inheritance. But in the penthouse 30 floors above the chaos, Nathaniel Whitfield wasn't watching the news. He was sitting quietly in his kitchen with Danny Carter, both of them still in the same clothes from that morning, neither of them quite ready to be alone. "I keep thinking about what he said," Nathaniel murmured, staring at the two untouched cups of tea between them. "This wasn't supposed to happen. Like it was just a bad break in a plan. Like my life was a scheduling problem." He shook his head slowly. 12 years building something, and it almost got taken from me by two people I trusted more than anyone else on earth. "But it didn't," Danny said quietly. "You're still here. Because of you," he said, looking up at her, and there was nothing guarded left in his expression at all. "You didn't have to fight back in there. You could have just let it happen and hoped I'd figure something out. Instead, you saved both our lives." Danny shook her head, exhaustion and emotion tangling together in her chest. "You're the one who pulled the trigger. Only because you gave me the chance to," he said. "I've had a gun in that safe for 6 years and never once believed I'd have the courage to use it. Turns out I just needed a reason big enough." The words hung between them, heavier than either of them was fully prepared for. And for the first time since the horror of that morning, something like quiet hope settled gently into the room. What happened after that was beyond imagination. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow unwinding of everything Nathaniel Whitfield thought he knew about his own life. Marcus was denied bail. The evidence against him too overwhelming, too damning. The betrayal too calculated for any judge to view him as anything but a flight risk. Vanessa, cooperating fully in exchange for a lighter sentence, would eventually plead guilty to lesser charges. Conspiracy, not attempted murder directly, trading 5 years of freedom to avoid a much longer one. The tabloids had a field day, as tabloids always do. Headlines painted Nathaniel as either a tragic victim or a cold, oblivious billionaire who should have seen his own fiancée's betrayal coming. Business partners called constantly, some out of concern, most out of curiosity, a handful clearly circling to see if his company's stability had cracked along with everything else. But inside the walls of that penthouse, something quieter and far more important was happening. Nathaniel gave Danny 2 full weeks of paid leave, though she protested that it wasn't necessary. "You went through the same thing I did," she told him over the phone one evening, Micah's cartoons playing faintly in the background of her small apartment. "Are you taking 2 weeks off?" "I don't know how to stop working," he admitted. "It's the only thing that's ever felt safe." "Maybe it's time you learn," she said gently, "that people can feel safe too." He showed up at her apartment 3 days later. Not the penthouse elevator kind of showing up, but an actual knock on an actual door, a small awkward bouquet of grocery store flowers in his hand because he genuinely didn't know what else to bring. Micah answered the door first, staring up at the tall stranger with wide, curious eyes. "Are you the dinosaur man?" the boy asked, and Nathaniel laughed, a real, surprised laugh before crouching down to the boy's level. "I might have left a triceratops on your counter once," he admitted. "I still have him," Micah said proudly, and something about the simple, unguarded warmth of a 6-year-old's trust cracked something open in Nathaniel's chest that 12 years of business success had never once managed to touch. Danny stood in the doorway watching the two of them, her heart doing something complicated and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She had spent 3 years quietly, carefully not letting herself hope for anything more than a decent paycheck and a boss who treated her like a person. She had never once let herself imagine this. A billionaire crouched on her worn welcome mat, laughing with her son over a plastic dinosaur, having nearly died beside her only weeks before. "I don't know what this is," Nathaniel admitted later. Once Micah had been coaxed to bed with the promise of pancakes in the morning, and the two adults sat on Danny's small second-hand couch with 2 cups of tea that neither of them had touched. I don't know what I'm supposed to say, or how any of this is supposed to work. 2 months ago I was engaged to someone plotting to kill me, and now I'm sitting in your living room feeling more like myself than I have in years. You don't have to know what it is yet, Danny said quietly. You just have to know it's real. It is real, he said, and for once, there was no hesitation in his voice at all. You're the only real thing that's happened to me in a very long time. Outside, the city hummed along the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding in a small apartment on the south side. A billionaire and a housekeeper sitting shoulder to shoulder, discovering that the wealth that mattered most had never once been about money at all. This is one story you'll never forget. A year passed the way years do. Slowly in the difficult moments, impossibly fast in the good ones. Marcus Riley was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Vanessa Cole served her reduced sentence and disappeared from Chicago society entirely. Her name scrubbed quietly from every event she'd once dominated. Corey Dax, in exchange for his cooperation, received a lighter sentence than he might have otherwise, though he would carry the physical reminder of that morning, a permanent scar in his shoulder, for the rest of his life. Nathaniel Whitfield rebuilt Whitfield Group with new leadership, a cleaner board, and a hard-won understanding that loyalty could not be assumed just because someone had known you the longest. He gave a rare interview 6 months after the attack, in which a reporter asked him what the entire ordeal had taught him about wealth. That it means nothing, he said simply, if you don't have people around you who'd stand beside you when it costs them something. I spent years surrounded by people who wanted what I had. It took almost losing everything to understand the difference between being wanted and being loved. He didn't mention Danny by name in that interview. He didn't need to. Anyone who knew him well enough to ask the question already knew the answer, standing quietly, deliberately out of the spotlight, exactly where she preferred to be. Danny no longer cleaned the Whitfield penthouse. That chapter of her life had closed gently, without drama, replaced by something neither of them had planned but both of them had chosen, one small, deliberate step at a time. She had gone back to school, nursing the dream she'd set aside a decade earlier, with Nathaniel's full support and absolutely no interference in how she chose to build her own life. He never once let her feel like his money had bought her future. He simply made sure fear of money would never again be the thing standing in her way. Micah, now 7, had an entire shelf of dinosaurs in his room, most of them gifts from a man he now simply called Nate, no longer the dinosaur man, no longer a stranger but something steadier, not quite a father, not yet, but something warm and permanent and safe, growing a little more solid with every shared dinner, every weekend trip, every quiet Tuesday evening spent doing homework at the kitchen island of an apartment that finally felt like enough. Nathaniel proposed to Danny 18 months after that terrible morning, not in some grand headline-worthy gesture, but quietly in her own kitchen, on an ordinary Thursday evening, Micah asleep in the next room, a small ring in a small box that he'd chosen himself instead of letting anyone else decide what mattered to her. "I'm not asking because you saved my life," he told her, kneeling on her kitchen floor with the same nervous sincerity of any ordinary man in love. "I'm asking because every day since then, you've shown me what it actually means to be safe with someone. Not protected. Not provided for. I didn't know the difference until I met you." Danny, tears streaming down her face for the second time in that same kitchen, once from terror, now from joy, said yes before he even finished the question. "If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you tonight, let it be this. The people who truly love you rarely announce it with the loudest voice or the most polished appearance. Sometimes they are standing quietly in the room the whole time, refilling your coffee, remembering your son's name, staying when leaving would have been so much easier. And sometimes the family we build has nothing to do with the one we were born into, and everything to do with who chooses to stand beside us when everything else falls apart. If this story moved you tonight, do something for me. Hit that like button, it truly helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you're new here because we tell stories just like this one every single week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that real love shows up quietly, not loudly, share this with them tonight. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.